Hello, I am Mr. Percy Locke, and you are listening to the Bow Street Society podcast.
Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to our January podcast. I am award-winning writer T.G. Campbell, author of the Bow Street Society Mystery and Casebook series.
And I am Richard A. Boxshall. More on me later, apparently.
In today's show, we'll have a character interview with Mr. Percy Locke and his wife, Dr. Lynette Locke. We also have an interview with Dave Barrowcliffe, who worked as a police officer in CID at the Bow Street Police Station itself in the 1960s.
But now it's time for an update on what is going on in the world of the Bow Street Society in this month's Holborn Herald.
Firstly, just a reminder that the 5th volume of the Bow Street Society casebook, The Case of the Fearful Father and Other Stories, was released last month as both an ebook and paperback. An ambient reading of one of the stories was also featured in December's bonus episode of this podcast.
In this month's Gaslight Gazette newsletter, the first part of the new casebook story has been released, The Case of the Scream in the Smog. Spooky.
My blog this month is about my writing routine and how I manage my time. Hopefully it will be of some help to other writers out there who are struggling to fit in their writing projects with their busy lives. And this is available to read now on my website, bowstreetsociety.com. But now is the moment you have all been waiting for. Up until now, my co-host Richard has been a bit of an enigma. So today I'm going to try to find out what makes him tick. So thank you for talking to me today, Richard. So first of all, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do?
Okay, in real life, I am airline cabin crew, which means I get to go to lots of exciting places or not, depending on the state of COVID. And I'm also an enthusiastic, I want to say hobby writer, because it is just a hobby at the moment, although hopefully it might go a little bit further than that. I started by taking part in the NaNoWriMo writing tournament, which is an American thing, stands for National Novel Writing Month, and every November they encourage you to start a new project. I started my first one in 2018. It was a story that has become called The English Hikikomori, and I've done something every year since then. The English Hikikomori is practically finished. It's kind of, I am deliberately procrastinating and not doing the final sort of sign-off read through, but it's 99.9% of the way there, isn't it? Because you've read it, haven't you?
Yes, I have read it. It's a brilliant book, and I have been trying to get him to release it, but it's a bit of a struggle.
Well, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I need this last read through before I start sending it off to people. But I am going to do that. I'm going to borrow or buy the Writers and Artists Yearbook next year and see if we can get anywhere with it.
It is a very cleverly written story and very character driven. So I think once it is actually released, I think people will really enjoy it. But you have also been working on 2 other projects, haven't you, in addition to that?
Yes. So the English Hikikomori is a very personal story. It's not entirely based on me because it's about someone working up to suicide, but there are, I suffered from depression in the past, and it was a way of me, I suppose, getting that elements of that out of my system. Everything I've written since then has been a bit more not real world, as it were. So my 2019 project is currently titled Empress of the Trees. I'm still working on the first draft because it's ridiculously long. It's going to be about 240,000 words long by the time I finish, which is, even for me, that's very long. And it's all about trees, as you can get from the title. So in the real world, trees actually talk to each other. Did you know this? I've probably already bored you with this, but
no, I didn't know this before you told me, though.
Okay, so they communicate with each other through strands of fungus through the earth called mycelia, and they divert up to 1/3 of their resources to actually maintaining this mycelia, and they literally use it to send signals to each other. You could almost call them a nervous system. Some wags have dubbed it the Wood Wide Web, the way these talk to each other. And so I'll give you an example. If there's a tree on the savannah in Kenya and a giraffe goes up and starts munching on the leaves at the top, tree 1 will say to tree 2, giraffe's munching on my leaves. And tree 2 will say, thank you very much. I'm going to pump something unpleasant tasting into my top leaves so he doesn't do it to me. And that happens. And they assumed initially this was done via something pheromonal, something the tree releases. But they also realized that even if the wind was going in the wrong direction, the second tree was still doing this. It was still putting something in the leaves to stop the giraffe from eating it. And they discovered it had to be through these mycelial strands. So the sort of story of Empress of the Trees is basically, what if the trees are an entity that all talk to each other? What if they are not very happy about what the human race has done to the planet? What if they give us an ultimatum, something along the lines of, hi, humans, we don't like what you're doing, sort it out, or we're going to stop breathing for 2 years. We'll survive, you won't. So it's very simple.
Yeah, but again, that one seems to be very character driven, and it's sort of got, it's on the surface it seems like quite sort of political, but actually there's much more than that. It's very much about character interactions and the character developments and the main characters, really, isn't it? And the character relationships.
Oh, absolutely, totally. I don't think I could be interested in the story if it was about, it is about the end of the world, spoilers, but I don't think I'd be interested in it if I didn't care about what happened to the people that I've populated that world with.
Now, you've also sort of dabbled a little bit with historical fiction in your other project, which was formerly called The Artist, which is now called Still Life, in the sense that it has flashbacks and goes back into different periods. Did you want to tell us a bit more about that project?
Yeah, this one, this was me in 2020, last year, going, I've got to start taking part in NaNoWriMo again in November last year, about 2 weeks before, thinking, I haven't got any ideas, I give up. And then out of nowhere, I've no idea where it came from, I had this idea of an immortal artist who traps people in his paintings. And it's about how he gets caught and stopped.
So it's a bit like Dorian Gray in the sense of, rather than it being the painting keeping him young, it's more that he's putting people in the paintings.
Yeah, they don't experience time when they're in the painting. So my opening chapter is actually a young lady called Molly Clark seeing her boyfriend off to war in 1915. He's going across to France. They live in Folkestone anyway, which is where the boats used to depart from. So he's literally getting on the phone, and she's very upset. And on the way back, she encounters this guy who says, "Oh, you look really upset. I'd like to try and cheer you up. I'd like to paint you." She's a bit distraught, doesn't really think, and goes, "Yeah, okay then." And she's never heard from again. And then we discover her later in the modern day. I think the story is set in 2018 because everything I write at the moment is pre-pandemic. I don't want to have to use the pandemic in a story yet. I will have to at some point, but I don't want to yet. So the story is set in 2018. Part of the story, she gets freed from the painting. And from her perception, no time has passed. She was in 1915. Suddenly it's 103 years later. And obviously she doesn't know why. She doesn't really understand what's going on around her. And yeah, and she's one of my favorite characters, actually.
So what made you want to start writing in the first place? Was it just a challenge of doing NaNoWriMo, or was it something a bit different to do? Or
no, I should have done it years and years and years ago. I've always enjoyed doing it. When I was at university, I procrastinated, and instead of writing my dissertation, I wrote 30,000 words of a fantasy novel. I did eventually do my dissertation as well, but I spent far too much time thinking about other things. I used to love writing at school. I got told by my teachers I could. And foolishly, having dabbled with it, trying to write this thing at university, I then didn't do anything. And when I heard about NaNoWriMo, every year it was like, I'm going to do it this year. I'm going to do it this year. I'm going to do it. And then I didn't bother. And then I don't know what changed in 2018. I think it was when I discovered there were local groups. Instead of just looking at a computer, you could physically meet up with other people who were taking part, who were also writers. I mean, that's how I met you.
It was, yeah. Even though ironically I wasn't doing NaNoWriMo at the time, but
you were in a gathering point that the people taking part in. Well,
yes,
the group that we are in, although you weren't taking part, is a NaNoWriMo driven group, isn't it? So
yeah, that's how it was originally formed. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, and so I kind of took part in 2018. I started late. It was halfway through the month, so I didn't do my 50,000 words. I did a decent number. And then by the end of that year, I had finished my first draft. And it was the first lengthy project I'd ever finished. I was very pleased with it. I edited it over the next year whilst also writing some of the first draft of Empress of the Trees. And yeah, I'm quite proud of it. Every time I read it, I think it's not too bad. I mean, I have sent it to friends and family. You do kind of wonder when friends and family read it, when they say they like it, if they're telling you something you want to hear. So that worries me a little bit. However, I do have one friend, other than yourself, who I think would have been honest if they hadn't liked it. But I've got one friend who is blunt to the point of rudeness. And if she had hated it, she would have said, Andrew, it's, and I'm not going to bleep the word out and I'm not going to say it, but she wouldn't, she'd have said, and she didn't. She said she really liked it. So.
Because writing is it can be a very personal thing, especially if you haven't sort of released things. I mean, obviously, I wrote the Bow Society first book knowing that I would release it. And it's different if you have written something not intended to release it and then having to sort of take that step to release. So is the particular reason why you haven't taken that step yet?
Just it's a pure case of getting round to it. I didn't start writing because I didn't get round to it. I haven't done anything with this book because I haven't got round to it. I don't think the pandemic helped. I think being stuck in my house, ironically, you'd have thought that would give me the time to do things like that. And to a degree it did, but I kind of burnt myself out a little bit writing for a bit and then had a big break last year in the middle of the year. But no, I promise you here, and here you go to all the listeners out there who are probably not that interested, but I will be doing something with the project next year. I think you can listen to it on YouTube. I do think I did a full reading of it on YouTube.
Because you do have a channel on Twitch, don't you? If people are not familiar with Twitch, so Twitch is traditionally a gaming streaming platform where people would play games, and there's a chat there's like a written chat box where you can interact with the streamer. There is also a small writer community on there. So Richard has his own channel on there, which you live stream your writing, don't you?
That's right, yes. And again, the reason I got into it was during the pandemic. I hadn't heard of Twitch. And when I did hear of it, I thought, well, I'm not a gamer. I'm not at all interested. And then a comedian I liked started, because he couldn't do stand-up shows and couldn't do anything from the theatre. He started doing stuff live on Twitch. I thought, also, it doesn't have to be about games then. So I came up with this, what I thought was an absolutely unique and genius idea of writing on there, until somebody from the Twitch Writers Network messaged me and said, oh, you do what we do, you should join.
But it is free to join Twitch. So you just sign up with your normal email address, and then if you just search for Richard A. Boxshall, then on there your channel will come up, and people can watch you for free, can't they? Follow you for free.
Yes, and I'm unfortunately, because of the job I do, it's very difficult to do a pattern to say I will be writing on these days at this time and this time and this time. So I tend to write when I can, but you can get a notification when I'm writing, and then if you're free and want to join me, you can.
Yeah, and obviously you can watch back in more recent videos. If he's done a live stream earlier on the day and you've missed it, you can go on his channel. It will say this is the stream for like 5 hours before, so you can rewatch them if you need to.
I do. Weirdly, I mean, I definitely, the total viewership is higher than what I get during the actual live stream usually. So I know people do go back and rewatch them, which I find a bit weird, because I don't know why anybody would want to, but clearly people do.
I mean, I've done this myself, and I think other people do it as well. They will write along with you. So they work on their own projects whilst you're writing on your project. And it does help you focus when you know that somebody else is focused as well. It's that sort of psychological thing. So I think a lot of people do that, go back and rewatch them. That's the reason. So I know I've done that before.
That's a fair comment, yeah. I do enjoy it. There's a nice little community. So you quite often on there, I'm not going to name any names, but there's a few other people that turn up regularly. And my numbers it's not snowballing or anything, but my numbers are starting to grow. So I do find a couple of people tend to join every week now, at least, and a few of them are now coming back and interacting with me as I record. And of course, we've used it, haven't we? We've used it as when we launched this podcast.
Yeah.
I managed to work out a way of actually getting you in, so we did a split screen interview, which is still available on your YouTube channel and probably mine as well.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Podcast and everything. So.
Yeah, so obviously, other than writing and sort of traveling with your job, what other interests do you have?
Oh, I don't have any at all. No, I own a dog, which I really enjoy. I like classic television. So you give me virtually anything from the 70s and 80s. That's sort of an old BBC show or comedy. I usually absolutely love it. I've got All Creatures Great and Small on DVD. The original one, not the hideous thing that's on Channel 5 at the moment. The original version of Survivors, not the horrendous remake that the BBC made. I really like Doctor Who, both the old and the new series. And during lockdown, I rediscovered The Bill, which I hadn't watched for years and years and years. And then they put the first sort of 10 years worth on UK TV Play, and I've been stubbornly watching them all.
Because there's a particular character, isn't it, you like in The Bill?
There is a character who is actually, I think, for about 16 or 17 years on the show, he's the chief inspector of Sunhill Police Station, and his name is Derek Conway. And I've got I heard that Derek Conway must be a distant relative somehow. John Conway from the Bow Street Society books. I love that idea, but every time I say it, you come up with reasons why it's physically impossible, because John Conway just wouldn't be interested enough in anyone to have an offspring, and without an offspring, it wouldn't really work.
Yeah, he's currently unmarried with no children, so yeah, it wouldn't work. But yeah, obviously that was completely coincidental. But yeah, I love that idea as well. That like, yeah, Derek Conway from the Bill was somehow a descendant of John Conway from my book. So
yeah. And he's such a good. I mean, there are some really good actors in the Bill, but that particular character is so funny. You know, he gives these little. If he's bored in a meeting, he'll sit there rolling his eyes, and you'll be under that he's bored in the meeting. And he is one of the best comedy straight characters I've ever seen, because he's totally serious when he needs to be, but he's so funny when he's not.
Yeah.
Sad, actually, because I think the actor who played him has died in the last few months, hasn't he?
Yeah, bless him. Yeah,
shame. It was really, 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 really good show. There's loads of other characters in there, but no, I really do like Doctor Who as well. So those are sort of things I like doing. I like cycling, except when I fall off my bike like I did last week. I like walking, and I do like my job because I get to travel and see a lot of lovely places.
Because on your YouTube channel, you were reviewing the audiobooks from Big Finish, weren't you, with Doctor Who? So people can go back and watch them if they're interested in Doctor Who audiobook series.
Yes, I mean, again, that was something I did during lockdown, and I kind of wish I'd kept it up, because I watched back one of the ones I did, and I came across quite well. I thought I came across fantastic, and some of the stuff I made sense, which wasn't my memory of it. That's one of the reasons I didn't bother in the end. But actually, looking back, it was quite coherent.
So for everybody who's listening who would like to find a bit more about Richard and his writing projects, how can they contact you? How can they follow you on social media? Okay,
the easiest way is to go to my website, Richard A. Boxshall. It'll be in the show notes, so you can work out how to spell that. But Richard A. Boxshall writes.wordpress.com, and my webpage it's basically a blog, but there's links to most of my other probably all of my other social media up there. So there's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, and
Instagram.
And Instagram and Discord. So there's quite a lot.
Well, I hope that has answered some of our listeners' questions. A big thank you to Richard for letting me interrogate him.
Hello, I'm Dr. Lynette Locke, and you're listening to the Bow Street Society podcast.
We would now like to welcome Dave Barrowcliffe to the podcast. On January the 4th, 1960, he joined the Metropolitan Police as a cadet. In August of the same year, he left the Metropolitan Police to join the regular army to serve in the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment.
And on the 2nd of September 1963, he rejoined the Metropolitan Police as a uniform constable and served Cannon Row and Salville.
He then served at Uxbridge, West Drayton and Bow Street as a CID officer until he retired in October 1968 and migrated to Australia. So welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you.
It's brilliant having you here. So first of all, I'd just like to start off by asking you, what was the recruitment process when you joined the Metropolitan Police?
Well, you made an application to join, and in due course you were contacted to attend 201 Borough High Street, Southwark, which was basically the recruiting centre, both for cadets and for PCs. So that was where you had your medical, you sat educational exam and interviews.
Okay, and there was actually an interesting story of how you actually decided to join the police. Would you like to tell us about that?
The first time or the second time?
The first time.
The first time was on the recommendation by the deputy principal of the college I went to, because it was obvious that I didn't like working in an office environment. I turned down 2 positions, which was an office-bound environment, and he knew I was more of a people person, and he thought that I'd be possibly better suited to that. One of the comments he made was that I had some contact with the police before, because I'd spent an afternoon in the police cells for having live ammunition on me, which we'd found out at a disused army ammunition dump. So I spent the afternoon in the cell because I wouldn't tell on who the other people were involved. So it was left at that. So, yeah, it was also an opportunity, I guess, is to go out and see the big wide world. Going to London was rather appealing to me at the time. So I applied, I got interviewed. I had the interviews in September, and I joined, I think it was on the 4th of January 1960. Went to Borough High Street straight away, and from there we went to Hendon. And so we had a month at Hendon.
Well, that's the ideal dive in for our second question then. So what form did the cadet training take at the Hendon Training School?
Well, okay, in 1960, or when I was there, the cadet corps, a cadet corps was started a couple of years later, but I guess it was pretty rudimentary at that time. We had a month's training, as it was, pretty limited. We did drill, plenty of sport, things like that. One of their big things was to try and make us proficient with and become touch typists. I think that was a failure, certainly in my particular case, and there's not too many touch typists in the police force. That's why we had civilian typists. But it was an introduction to, shall we say, a policing type environment. But after a month, we then went to a division, and I went to Tower Bridge Police Station. And I was for accommodation, I was at Gilmore House in Kennington. It certainly wasn't as structured, I think, as it was later on with the Cadet Corps. I know and didn't know a great deal about that at all. I can only speak from how it was with me. I was quite comfortable. There was a couple of the guys were first time away from home, etc. It was a bit of a cultural shock to some of them, especially living in, it was, for cadets, it was a dormitory type situation. So as I said, it was a bit of a cultural shock to a lot of them. Didn't worry me because I'd been in the Air Training Corps and been to annual camps and did such things like that. So I guess that was a precursor. So it didn't particularly faze me at all. Possibly discipline phased a few of them. Didn't worry me at all.
And had the training evolved at all between your first and second stints at the school?
You couldn't really make a comparison, other than it was. I still went to Hendon, whereas some of the people went to Peel House. It was a totally different scenario. It was for 13 weeks, and it was full on about police duties, dealing with situation, practical, the whole thing. It was you couldn't compare one from the other. The only thing you could compare, we still did drill. We still had the same drill sergeant. We still had some of the same staff. But as far as the content, the training content, the academic side of it and the practical side was totally different to being a cadet.
So you're a newly trained police constable working in, was it Cannon Row to start with?
Yes.
So what was your first solo shift like as a newly trained police constable?
Well, there was one. I was confronted with a situation which wasn't in the instruction book and we were never taught how to handle it. What it was that people told me that there was a person who was causing mayhem with trying to cross a pedestrian crossing outside St Margaret's Church. And he kept on going part way, stepping onto the pedestrian crossing. So vehicles were stopping very quickly, etc., etc. Well, I couldn't avoid it. It was there. I managed to get him across the road, or he got halfway across the road, and basically I had to get him onto the pavement for his own safety as much as anything else. He started to try and cross the road again, and you're on your own. The closest phone was at Cannon Row Police Station. There was nobody else around. What did you do? I couldn't leave him there. There's a chance that he could walk into the road or stagger into the road. So I thought the best thing was that I put him over my shoulder on a fireman's lift and promptly took him to Cannon Row Police Station. But halfway there, I happened to bump into the section sergeant and the duty officer. So there was a few words, what are you doing there, with a few expletives, etc. So that was my first arrest. It was on a Saturday night. He was bailed out to appear at Bow Street Magistrates Court on the Monday. He was bailed out on the Sunday to appear on the Monday. I appeared at the court on the Monday. He didn't turn up. I obtained a warrant and I never saw him again, and that warrant was never executed. So I don't know what happened to him. But anyway, it was a case of, well, what would you have done? Nothing else was said about it. Sometimes you have to make a decision. I made a decision, rightly or wrongly, but I made the decision, and you stood by it. So there you go. So that was my first arrest, and they're still looking for him now.
You also did a spell at the Criminal Records Office at New Scotland Yard. And what were your duties there?
A month there to, should we say, get a far better understanding of how the CRO, as we called it, worked. You knew a little bit about it. You used it, but it was literally by telephone or by form filling, etc., etc. So here was a case of, should we say, some hands-on experience of the different facets of CRO. So it was a month. It was, again, a learning curve, a learning experience, and part of the things you learnt there stood you in good stead.
Specifically, what did you actually have to do while you were there?
The first place was that they'd got, well, you'd call it a call centre there, but that was before the word came into effect. There was banks, there was possibly about, I'm trying to think, about 20, 30 phone points. It were in rows, so you had an officer standing and there was a switch as a phone in front of her, and there was a board which lit up. So every time it lit up, it meant an incoming call, and you'd take that call. Now, invariably, the phone calls were about two things, about whether the person had a criminal record or whether a person was wanted. So the first thing was you did a search of what they called the nominal index. And that was in a booklet form, and it was all paper. So you would go through, it was alphabetical. So you'd get his full name and his date of birth. And from then, so that was the first of the process. So it would carry on from then. Was he known? Was there anything outstanding against him, etc., etc.? There's different sections within CRO that dealt with different aspects, stolen motor vehicles, pedal cycles. I'm just looking, I did write some, I was trying to stretch my memory, method index. There's all these different indexes and all the rest of it. Basically, it's a clearinghouse of information. It's a source of information. And I guess by working there, you had far better working knowledge of how it all interacted and integrated with each other.
So obviously, in the modern day, we're used to somebody being able to tap something on a computer and they get the result instantly. How long would it take between the phone call arriving, asking for the information, and that information going back to the relevant police station?
You'd write down their details, as I said, full name, date of birth, and you'd go to the nominal index, which was 3 or 4 meters away, and you'd go, it's all alphabetical, so you would go and do a physical check. That would only take a couple of minutes, and then you could say he's wanted or is not wanted, etc., etc., or you would carry it on. So there was no time lag if it's from a phone inquiry. You could also have paper inquiries, which took longer. In those days, you could go to a public call box, call the operator, and call free phone 219, which was a free phone call to Scotland Yard. So that was technology as it was in those days. So a police officer out in the street would call in from a public call box more times than none, or from a police box or a police post, which will then go to a police station and then on to Scotland Yard, CRO.
So presumably the nominal index had to be updated fairly frequently.
The process, if a person is arrested, right, and charged, the first form is what they call the CRO 74 form, and that gets sent to Scotland Yard, or CRO, and it's given an identification. It's numeric, or it was numeric then. Say it would be 4 digits slash and whatever the year would. So it'll be 4579/21 today, right? So that started the file. So from there, the court process, all the details of what he was arrested for, the results if he's found guilty, etc., 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 and there's fingerprint files, the whole work. So from an arrest, you build up a history, and that is in file form. Now, it was all paper, so you basically had a file with all the details in it. So you could then also search, CRO, you could search a person if you've got a criminal record, you could search that and you could pull his file, which would have this whole history. But I don't, it's obviously technology's taken over and computerization nowadays. But I'd say the process is still there. Obviously, the handling time is a lot quicker than it would have been.
So when you did your training at Hendon, one of the things you studied was police history. And when you transferred to Bow Street some years later, how aware were you of its role in the formation of the Metropolitan Police?
That didn't really, in itself, didn't really play a part. You had a job to do, and it didn't matter which station you were stationed to. There was obviously a history behind it. And of course, being next door to Bow Street Magistrates Court, which possibly had got even bigger history, but being Bow Street in itself didn't change what you were doing. It had no real bearing on it at all. Historically, yes, it was, I think it's the third building in, it's been third police station in Bow Street, 28 Bow Street. The environment or the surrounding area or the area of the Bow Street covered or was responsible for, which dictated what really happened, not the police station itself.
How were you assigned to Bow Street?
When I was appointed a detective constable on probation, you were on 12 months probation, I was posted to C Division. How I got posted to C Division, I cannot tell you, I wouldn't know, but I got posted to C Division. So I wanted to check up a few things. Fortunately, there was a first-class detective sergeant at West End Central who had been a DS at Uxbridge when I was at Uxbridge. So I gave him a call and said, what's the story? Where's the vacancies and all the rest of it? So he said that there was vacancies at West End Central, which was then called CD1 and CD2. I don't know whether you realise that in those days, West End Central was split into two police stations, the same building, and it's called CD1 and CD2. And there was vacancies there, and there was also one vacancy at Bow Street. So they normally fill the vacancies at the divisional station first, and then it goes down the line. So I didn't particularly want to be at West End Central. So, as I said, it was a case of first in, best dressed. Well, I decided not to be first in, best dressed. I arrested somebody on the weekend, so I had to appear at Bow Street, at Uxbridge Magistrates Court on the Monday morning. So I couldn't be at West End Central. I didn't get there till the afternoon, and that was how I was able to go to Bow Street. So in actual fact, I got the posting I wanted.
Was there a particular reason why you wanted to be at Bow Street?
I didn't want to be at a divisional station. Too many governors was. I'd say that it would be reasonable to say that you perhaps had a little bit more. The fewer governors, the more freedom you had.
Okay, that's interesting.
Okay, so you're now at Bow Street. You're working for CID in Bow Street. I suppose a lot of people now will have a perception of what a CID office looks like, probably based on what they've seen on television and stuff like that. But of course, it would probably be completely different in the 1960s. So can you describe the office for me, what it looked like, what it sounded like?
I tell you all three.
Okay.
Was one room, and there was 1, 2, 3, 7 of us, 8 with a typist, crowded into one room. Not much room at all. Then I went to West Drayton, which was a sectional station, but it was a brand new building. And there was plenty of space. It was light, it was airy. I might add that Uxbridge Police Station was Victorian and basically had been condemned years before that. Bow Street, the CID was on the first floor, and there were 5 officers, clerk's office and the first class DS's office, and 3 general offices and the DI's office. Now, the office that I was in, I shared it with 4 other DCs and a DS and the 2 typists. Bow Street had 2 lady typists. And so it was a fair-sized room, but again, it was a Victorian building, very high ceilings, and the window looked right across the road, right into the Covent Garden Opera House. The desks, a typical government issue, we had them along one wall, and on the other side of the room, in either corner, with the typist, one typist was in one corner and the other typist was in the other corner. But we were in and out the office all the way out. The benefit of that office was it was closest to the canteen to go and get a cup of coffee.
Did each desk have its own phone, or was there just one general phone for the office? Or
the DI had his own phone, which had a separate number. There was a CID phone in 2 CID phones in another office, which is a separate number. And then there was one phone which was an extension from the reserve office downstairs. So you got internal and external, as it was in those days. There were dial phones as well. That was the time when also the public telephone boxes changed when I was at Bow Street. It went down from the press button A, press button B in 4 pennies when it came to STD dialing. So there you go, start of technology again. And I don't think too many people would know what a dial phone is like now, let alone press button A, press button B in a public phone.
I do remember dial phones, but no, I don't remember the button A, button B phones.
You don't? Oh, dear me.
The other thing I'm curious about is what the room smelled like. I know it's a strange question to ask, but in those days it was perfectly normal and perfectly acceptable for people to smoke in an office.
Correct.
And also, you said earlier you were very close to the canteen. So did you get wafts of lunch coming in as well?
Occasionally, not often, but it did now and again. It was just one of those acceptable things. You didn't, it was part of the environment. It didn't certainly didn't faze me. And I can't remember anybody making any adverse comment about it. As I said, the thing was the benefit of being close to the canteen was you didn't have to go far to go and get a cup of coffee. So we'd go into the canteen most times, get a cup of coffee and have it at our desk. But the real, if you're talking about real smells, well, of course, the worst smells were the ones in the cells. That must have permeated into the walls. I don't know how it did, but it was a smell which was there, and no matter how they tried to disinfect it and all the rest of it, it never went away.
Can you describe that smell to people who've obviously never smelled it? How would you describe it?
Certainly wasn't a pleasant smell. All bodily functions and fluids frequently were all over in the cells. So, you could imagine what they were like. They certainly weren't. They become.
So did it smell a little bit like a public toilet, for example, maybe?
Yes, but worse.
You mentioned you touched upon telephones, and obviously nowadays in modern offices you'd have like computers at desks. What kind of equipment and technology did you have in your office apart from the phones?
There's a couple of typewriters we shared. They weren't electric typewriters, they were all manual typewriters. There was a lot of work that we did which was still handwritten. Certain forms, at times, there was not enough typewriters to go around, so there was a queue at times for typewriters. And also the other things, if it was long reports for, should we say, child committals and stuff like that, which can get rather involved, the typists were shorthand typists, so you would dictate to them. Again, there was only 2 typists. We shared amongst ourselves, so sometimes we had to wait and there was delays on stuff. It was a case of first in, first served. But we managed, we coped. There was no alternative.
It was the way it was.
Exactly. As I said, it was just the technology was just starting to come in basically just before I left.
Yeah, could you tell us earlier about sort of the photocopies having key operators? So how did all of that work in terms of getting stuff photocopied?
Only the key operators were allowed to use the photocopier, to fill it with paper, put the toner. Rank Xerox had the contract to provide the photocopiers for the whole of the Met. So they were doing the training courses and everything. And of course, there was occasional malfunction, so you had to wait for the technician to come and fix them up and pull them apart, etc., etc. But it was a step forward. But as I say, one of the byproducts of that was that a lot more stuff, because it was easy to photocopy, was being distributed and sent around. Probably it's a new toy to a lot of people.
So you worked both as a uniformed police officer and as an officer in CID. What were the noticeable differences between the two roles?
I'm still a firm believer there's the best deterrent going around is having a uniformed PC in uniform walking the streets. It's an unknown thing, but his presence of a police officer on the streets is fundamental as far as I'm concerned to the safety, and it prevents crime as much as anything. As far as the CID is concerned, you're basically coming from a different way. You're trying to solve crimes and detect crime, but it was hand in glove. Or when we started off was that, of course, the CID handled all criminal cases. So if a uniformed PC arrested a person for a criminal offence, the uniform officer would be the charging officer, but the CID officer would be, should we say, would administrate the process of going to court and through the whole system. That slightly changed when they introduced CID investigated all crimes, and then they split it in a bit, 66, and they split the crime book into major crime and minor crime. Police officers started to come in and deal with minor crimes like loss of a lasting pedal cycle, simple stuff like that. That was trying to take off the load off the CID officers with the caseload they had. But it was more or less of, I'd say a uniform officer was there as a physical deterrent, and the CID officer was an investigator.
So how different were the working hours? Presumably a uniformed officer within reason will know roughly what time their shift ends, and barring something big happening just before they go off clock, they kind of know when they're going to finish. Was that the case in CID?
Uniform, it was a 3-shift roster. We worked earlys and lates. Early turn was 6 till 2. Late turn was 2 till 10. That worked for 6 weeks, alternate earlys and lates. And then you did 3 weeks straight nights, which was 10 till 6. Our working hours were on the hour, but we had to parade on a quarter to the hour. So in other words, if you were early turn 6 till 2, you paraded at quarter to 6, quarter to the hour. So in other words, effectively, you should go out on the street on the hour. CID officers, their time, the normal time, which would be 9 till 5, or a split shift, which was 9 till 1, and then you recommence duty from 6 o'clock till 10 o'clock. Night duty, there was a reduced number of you on, most of your time was days. Night duty was 10 till 6, but there was only a couple of you on night duty. But having said that, there was no fixed hours. Most of us did overtime. Frequently, we did a 13-hour day, 9 till 10, because of the workload of what we were doing. And plus, the other thing was you didn't book off. I'd say our CID officers' working hours were far more flexible, and by necessity, you didn't knock off at 5 o'clock or whenever you thought, or 10 o'clock. You just had to carry on. But so did uniform to that extent. But their hours were more regimented, I'd say, than CID officers.
You also had a very different working environment to the uniform officers, presumably. For a start, I believe you were allowed to actually work in a pub if you were getting information. Why
does everybody bring that one up? You wouldn't find too many informants in the church, would you?
No.
You'd find more in the pub. As long as you recorded it, a CID officer had a diary, and that diary was checked every week. And if you entered into a licensed premises, you had to record that you went into the licensed premises, and you'd probably put an entry into your diary. You entered into the Campbell's Head public house where you purchased refreshment for informant while seeking information re local crime. And you could buy him a drink and you could claim reimbursement for it, which you invariably did. But I do know, uniform officers would go to the back door again, whether they should or whether they shouldn't, that's a moot point. But CID officers were allowed to go into public houses, yes. The more informants you talk to, the more it's going to cost you. I did have a issue once with my DI, and he said that I'd put in a bigger bill than he would do. And there was an unwritten law that rule, dependent on your rank, was dependent on how big your bill could be. I put I didn't think it was heavy. It was justified. And the DI said I'd put in a bigger bill than he did. And I said, I'm out in the streets a bit more than you are, Governor. And he tried and said, I'm limiting you to 10 shillings a week for 4 weeks. Well, couldn't see too many informants on 10 bob a week. So after about 2 weeks, he relented and said, whatever. You see, gathering information at one time doesn't necessarily mean you get an arrest straight away. So your expenses are for in a week period, but an investigation could go over in a period of weeks. So I could spend the money this week, but the result will be 3 weeks down the track.
There are numerous fictitious portrayals of the police in books, TV programmes, etc. In general terms, how successful do you think these are in portraying the police forces they're depicting?
The first thing is, it is purely entertainment. A lot of things a police officer did that is not good viewing. You shouldn't take it as gospel. There's many of those shows, and I never have. But a lot of people think it's exactly what happens. Now, I think the other thing is that there's been a complete change of how a lot of these police shows are on the TV. I can go back to when there was things like Dixon of Dock Green with Jack Warner. That wasn't realistic. And then you've got other shows where there's a lot of car chases, a lot of violence and use of firearms and things like that. And again, that goes to the other extreme. To get an accurate portrayal was very hard. One big thing is they all seem to get the culprit before the show's ended. You know,
Yeah.
they get 100% clear up rate.
Yeah.
Which show would you say, is there a show that got close to being realistic, or were they all completely pie in the sky?
I've never really thought that. Some are a bit more realistic than others. I watch Shums, and even now I could say, well, that's not real. You know, it's purely entertainment. You know, that would never happen in a real situation. And then I have a bad habit of picking up things which are completely wrong, especially cars going in, they're going to a certain location, but they're going down the wrong street. That's in the opposite direction they should be, and all the rest of it. It really is entertainment. There are some truths and some aspects are factual, but there's a lot of, say, license. Please accept it purely as entertainment.
Mm. And one thing I did actually want to ask you, sort of going on from that, is there was a series of 30-minute dramatisations based on Metropolitan Police cases that was called Scotland Yard, and it was made between 1953 and 1961 and was shown in cinemas, and it was introduced and narrated by criminologist and author Edgar Lustgarten. Had you heard of that when you joined the police, or had you ever seen those episodes in the cinema?
I was aware of them, and one of those, probably late 50s, early 60s. The other one was Fabian of the Yard. Mm. I don't know whether you've seen any of them.
I haven't seen it, but I have heard of it, yeah, Fabian of the Yard, yeah.
Again, it was entertainment.
Because I know I've seen all the episodes of Scotland Yard, and it was presented more as a dramatization of actual cases. It seemed to be a bit more realistic, portraying that sense of actually what was involved in solving those cases. But from your point of view, as somebody maybe seen those and then worked in the police, how realistic would you say that particular series was?
Well, there's been a number of shows like that, and which have got factual background, but then they normally put an overrider that they've altered it purely for different reasons, right? As I said, a lot of police work, if you did it what they actually did, you wouldn't get any viewers, right? Mm. A lot of it, and there's a lot of police work which happens that doesn't even get a mention in the newspaper or in any form of media. You know, it's only, should we say, sensational cases, any coverage, and basically those actual cases which have been depicted invariably are more sensational than the everyday, what I call bread and butter type crimes, etc. Should we say, the more brutal or the more salacious it is, the bigger the headline. And, you know, that's the way it has been, you know, and they're still talking about characters and things which happened years ago, and they keep on regurgitating. You know, how many times have they regurgitated about the great train robbery? Mm. You know, they still talk about that, and that was what, August 1963. But they still talk about that today. They still talk about the Craig twins, you know. When was that? When did they get arrested? 1968. Mm. The Richardson gang, you know. There are certain things or crimes which have been committed or people have been convicted, which they keep on doing. But in the meantime, there's lots of, shall we say, other crimes being committed and being solved. If it's not sensational enough or salacious enough, it doesn't get much coverage. Police work still carries on regardless.
Well, thank you for talking to us today. It's been absolutely fascinating. I could honestly just speak to you for hours and hours and hours, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well.
Yes, I have. You've made me stretch my memory, and it's brought back some good memories. I must tell my kids, because my kids don't really know much about me.
Hello, I'm Vicky Pipe from Bow Street Police Museum, and you're listening to the Bow Street Society podcast.
Thanks to Dave for that fascinating insight into the Metropolitan Police in the 1960s.
Now we are going to the home of husband and wife team Dr. Lynette Locke and illusionist Percy Locke to talk to them about their involvement in the Bow Street Society, amongst other things.
We have come to the private practice of Dr. Lynette Locke here on Cleveland Terrace to speak to the lady herself about being a qualified medical doctor and member of the Bow Street Society. Joining us is fellow Bow Street Society member and famous illusionist, Mr. Percy Locke. Thank you for welcoming us into your beautiful home.
Friends of Miss Rebecca Trent are friends of ours.
Thank you. We're delighted to be here, as I know our listeners are very keen to learn more about you.
As we are delighted to have you.
Let's begin the interview, shall we, darling?
But of course.
Dr. Locke, what challenges do you face as a woman running her own medical practice? And that was asked by Rita W.
Well, as you can imagine, female doctors are a relatively new addition to the field, and like any new thing, there is a certain level of resistance, shall we say. However, there are men who are open-minded enough to welcome us into the profession and support us in the pursuit of medical science.
Here, I've always been a very great supporter of my wife.
Darling, I was referring to male colleagues.
Very well.
Thank you. The other issue will be convincing the general public that us females will not faint at the sight of a mere paper cut, but one step at a time.
Mr. Locke, listener C. Fox would like to know, what do you like best about solving crime?
As an illusionist, I enjoy a good mystery and a good puzzle, and I see solving crimes, as very much like solving a puzzle. It is almost like a magic trick. You see the end result, the presentation, and then have to work back to find out how it was done. And I enjoy that aspect. Also, being a member of the Bow Street Society has enabled me to use some of my more unusual skill set, shall we say.
Listener Kim T would like to ask how long you've been married and where did you meet?
Well, it is coming up for just over a year since we were married.
Yeah.
We actually met at a dinner party my parents were holding. Percy was there doing some little magic tricks.
Some close-up illusions.
And then we had let's call it a chance encounter a couple of weeks later.
Yes, we did. And I personally was smitten from the start. I mean, she's beautiful, intelligent, capable, and since meeting her, I have not had eyes for anyone else.
Well, yes.
Rita W. would like to ask, what would be your ideal date night?
A date? What date? Which date?
A romantic evening.
Oh, I see.
Well, we don't really get those anymore, do we, darling? I mean, between my work and then Percy being at the theatre and then the addition of the Bow Street cases, we don't really do romantic evenings out anymore.
Yes, it's just challenging because we are both very busy people and...
Well, we did used to go down to that little restaurant near the theatre when we were first married, didn't we?
Yes, I remember.
Of course, Percy goes quite often still, but with his friends rather than me.
But I do think that with you joining the Bow Street Society, we will spend more time with each other and have the opportunity to do things together that we enjoy.
Yes, but it's not quite a romantic evening in, is it, darling? I mean, if that is the question, I suppose an evening in with just the two of us would be ideal.
Of course, darling.
What would you say is the other's most endearing quality and why?
I mean, your charm, but then I suppose that's what irritates you most about me as well. The whole of London knows how charming Percy is. No, I don't, but all jokes aside, I am fully aware of how lucky I am to be married to a man who supports me in my profession. There are many who would have insisted I gave it up, but Percy, allows me to continue, and for that, I am very grateful.
Of course, I will always support you, darling, in whatever you choose to do. I would have to say that your most endearing quality is your caring nature. You look after me very well.
Out of the members of the Bow Street Society that you know, which would you say you have enjoyed working with the most and why? And that was asked by a listener called Kaz.
Percy, do you want to start off with that one?
Yes, certainly. I enjoy working with all the members of the Bow Street Society. They are all equally intelligent and interesting, but I think if I had to choose one person, it would be Miss Rebecca Trent. We have a long history together. We used to work in the theatre together, and we enjoyed our time immensely, so it has been a great pleasure to reacquaint our working relationship.
Is there no one else you enjoy working with, Percy?
Well, of course, my wife joining the Bow Street Society has been a great pleasure, and I look forward to working with you very much.
Thank you, darling. I mean, really, there could be only one person who I could answer, and that would be, well, Dr. Weeks, of course.
Dr. Weeks?
Of course. Dr. Weeks is an interesting man, but he supports me in this profession. He doesn't care whether or not I'm a woman. He simply cares whether or not I'm a good doctor and if I can do the job. His support is invaluable.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, I fully support you as well.
Do you know the other thing that I really do admire about Dr. Weeks is his absolute commitment to his profession. Absolutely nothing distracts him. The men of London could learn a thing or two from Dr. Weeks, I think.
Yes.
So just going on from that question, listener KM asks, which of the Bow Society members have you least liked working with and why?
I would like to answer this question. Like I said, I enjoy working with all of the members of the Bow Street Society, but I would have to say, if pushed, Dr. Weeks would probably be the one that I find the most challenging. I find him arrogant, I find him rude, he has a lack of manners that I find very distasteful.
Well, darling, if we're going to talk about challenging, I don't think we can leave you out of the conversation.
Well, obviously, being married and working together does have its challenges, darling.
Is that the time? We're going to have to end there, I'm afraid.
I think that is wise.
Thank you for this delightful conversation.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's definitely time we left. Thank you again, Dr. Locke, Mr. Locke. It's been enlightening.
That's it for this month. We will see you in March for the next exciting instalment of the Bow Society podcast. Bye.
You have been listening to the Bow Street Society podcast. It was written and presented by T.G. Campbell and Richard A. Boxshall.
Special thanks to all the contributors, including Sabrina Poole, Phil Rowe and Jaden Brandliff.
You can find out more about the Bow Street Society series by T.G. Campbell at bowstreetsociety.com. You can also find out more through social media. Search for Bow Street Society on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube.
Thank you for listening.
All podcast content is the intellectual property of T.G. Campbell.